Hello students, my name is Liz Attia and today's topic is the ethical theory of deontology. Okay, so deontology, what do we mean by that? Well, in fact, before we start that, let me just first introduce to you some of the competing approaches to ethical decision making. So there's many approaches to resolving ethical dilemmas, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that these are the only ones, but these are the ones that certainly we're going to be focusing on in this unit. So the deontological, the consequentialist, virtue-based, post-structuralist, feminist, liberal, and humanitarianism or communitarianism. Let's talk first about deontology. So the word deon is actually a Greek word in origin, and it means binding duty. So deontology is often actually called duty-based ethics as well. It's considered to be intrinsic intrinsic in nature, which means things or actions are right and wrong in and of themselves, irrespective of the consequences or irrespective of the effect. So rape might be seen as intrinsically wrong, independent of the consequences of rape. So the action in and of itself is right or wrong. It relies on universal principles, traditionally and historically theological or religious in basis. So universal principles such as do not kill, do not steal. An action may be ethically wrong even if it has good consequences, or it might be ethical even if there are bad consequences. So going back to point one, the idea that in fact actions or things are in and of themselves right or wrong, irrespective of the effect. Moderate deontologists, and we'll talk about this in a few slides' time, consider that consequences might be relevant, but they're certainly not the guiding feature or principle in terms of assessing whether an action is ethical or not. So they're considered to be a contributory influence as opposed to being the ultimate determinant as to whether an action is correct or not. So there are two types of deontology I'd like to introduce you to. The first is act deontology. So act deontologists argue that we might and we must decide separately in each situation what is right or wrong without any appeal to rules. So in fact, there is room under act deontology to consider the idea that it is a case-by-case basis, and it shouldn't just be this guiding principle of a rule that's been made by the divine creator or a theological understanding or even a social consensus about what's right and wrong, that depending upon the circumstances, there must be some consideration of the dynamics and the context of the particular dilemma. So interestingly, act deontology suggests that one must decide what's morally right or wrong without universal rules, and it depends on particular circumstances. But having said that, deontology itself as a principle actually is premised on this idea of duty, and that action is intrinsically right or wrong. So you can see there's some contradiction there in terms of the argument. Real deontology, on the other hand, talks about ethical conduct as actually being prescribed by a set of universal dictums or understanding. What do I mean by that? Well, there's rules that indicate and that guide and that direct human behaviour. So those rules might come from a religious basis, so a theology, or a religious conviction. It might be based on social approaches, so those, the consensus within the society. So most would argue that stealing is the wrong thing to do, irrespective of a religious underpinning for that. Most would actually see that harming somebody else is the wrong thing to do. So based on a societal approach and a societal norm, a moral gut feeling, the intuition of what you have about what's right and what's wrong to do, what sits well with you in terms of your human nature, and also then in terms of being pure reason or deduction. So it's logical, it makes sense. And that's an understanding so while point 3 is talking about an emotional response, point 4 actually focuses on then a reasoned response, cognitively, what sits well with you in terms of what's right and wrong to do based on a deductive reasoning of the action. So Kant provides 3 principles for reason-based deontological decision-making. He actually says that leading a moral life means being submitted to unwavering universal moral laws. He says that people themselves as rational actors have inherent value and should be treated as such. And he also says that people's dignity is violated whenever a person is treated merely as a means to an end. So he actually says that really in terms of the moral and ethical basis for decision making, human beings do have it within themselves to submit to moral laws when it makes sense, and that it needs to actually be grounded in logic. Okay, so using the 4 different justifications for a rule deontology, I'd like you to consider the issue of FGM and provide, based on the justification of theology, the societal norm, what's intuition and reason, provide a justification as to whether you think FGM under those justifications would actually be considered ethical or not. Okay, so the value in terms of the advantages of deontology as an ethical theory, I guess it reminds us of the importance of reasoning in ethical decision making, this idea that it needs to make sense. Its critique, however, is that I guess because it does talk about this universal principle of what's right and wrong irrespective of consequences, it's less open for analytical debate. So rule deontologists will actually say to you, well, the guiding principle in this decision is this dictum, this rule that says you do not do it, irrespective then of the consequences, the effect, the dynamic, the situation, the context. So it's less open for criticism. And that is, in fact, one of the critiques of the theory, that it tends to be very dogged in its application without the ability then to be critical of application. The rules are too rigid and are expected to be followed universally rather than individual situations being considered, and duties may come into conflict. And deontology offers no guidance in resolving this conflict. So what do you do, for example, when you have 2 rules that at face value appear to actually be in contradiction to one another? How do you actually then rank the rules? What's the order of precedence in terms of what should be given priority in those particular situations? And consequences need to be considered or need to be given more of a primary focus. And we'll go back and actually talk about, I guess, these critiques as strengths of some of the other ethical theories that we consider. Thank you, students. That brings today's topic to an end.